We're very much committed to deterrence in the first island chain, but we cannot and should not be expected to do it alone. We believe that there shouldn't be any weak links in that chain, because if there is any weak areas, that puts an increased burden on the other parts of the first island chain. And so I think we expect all of our allies and partners to contribute equally. We think that to have an effective dialogue, Taiwan needs to have the confidence in order to engage from a position of strength, because we've seen too many examples of when countries have tried to negotiate with from a position of weakness, the outcomes have not served their interests and really compromises their ability to have a dialogue based on equality and respect. Right. Well, I think one of the messages especially for the conflict of the Middle East, is that the U.S. has the ability to project overwhelming military force at very short notice anywhere on the planet. You saw that in South America earlier this year. You're seeing that in the Middle East. I think a second message is for the United States to be effective, we need to have our allies and partners also provide a baseline of deterrence that can support U.S. military operations. And so, from that perspective, the Trump administration has called on all of our allies and partners to increase their defense spending to 5% of GDP. And we think the steps that countries around the world, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, are taking to increase their investments, especially in areas like air defense and counter-UAS systems, is very important. And I think the third message, especially out of the Middle East, from both sides of the conflict, is the increasing use, and the same as in Ukraine, is the increasing use of uncrewed systems, unmanned systems, whether they're air or sea systems. And so I think that also sends a very important message as Taiwan and other parts of the region look at what are the most effective deterrent capabilities they can acquire. Well, actually, really since 2022, there's been a huge focus on enhancing Taiwan's self-defense capabilities. I think the combination of the Ukraine conflict and then the major exercises that increased tensions in the Taiwan Strait that happened in August of 22 made both Washington and Taipei double down on our focus. And so initially we sought to use new authorities such as foreign military financing, presidential drawdown authority to try to get critical capabilities to Taiwan as quickly as possible. But I think especially in the last 18 months, we saw new opportunities actually to rely on Taiwan's own industrial base to help fulfill Taiwan's defense needs. And I would say there's three reasons we really started to focus on this as a new avenue for cooperation. First is we saw a greater willingness for Taiwan's traditional technology and manufacturing companies to enter into the defense industry. Taiwan has one of the most impressive technology and industrial bases in the world, but for the last 50 or 70 years, it's really been focused only on commercial products. But more and more we saw interest from Taiwan companies, both startup companies or established manufacturing and technology companies, to work in the defense field, which really unlocked huge potentials. And second, we also realized a lot of the defense equipment that Taiwan needs are not necessarily those traditional large defense systems, but are things like drones, things like AI-enabled communication system and control systems, things that actually can be sourced from the private sector. And so I think the change in character of warfare has actually opened up new opportunities for collaboration with the traditional private sector. And I think the third reason is the U.S. military also trying to acquire these systems, and the U.S. is relying on our private sector, especially these technology companies that are getting into these new areas of military supplies and technologies. And these companies were looking for supply chain partners because they realized how much, for example, in the drone space, they relied on components from places like China, which really is not sustainable from a security perspective or a supply chain resilience perspective. And so we saw a huge interest in U.S. drone companies coming to Taiwan, finding partners here in the Taiwan's private sector. And as you may have recalled, in September of 2024, we brought 26 U.S. leading drone companies to Taiwan. And I think all of them have already established, since that time, deep supply chain connectivity and integration with Taiwan. So all these three factors really drove us in this direction. It's a very exciting area, I think, both for our security needs, but also for our economic and industrial partners on both sides. Yeah, no, I've had a chance to visit a lot of different Taiwan companies in Taipei and Taoyuan and Taichung, Kaohsiung, all over the island. I think it's very impressive to see how quickly Taiwan companies can change direction. Taiwan companies are very flexible, very nimble, and so I think this gives Taiwan a huge advantage. I was here during COVID. And I remember how quickly, when there was a shortage of PPE, especially face masks, all of a sudden Taiwan's companies just changed into face mask producers, became the second largest producers in the world. I see a similar process going on right now as Taiwan companies see an opportunity in the defense sector and are moving there. And so going to companies who've doing totally different lines of business for decades, all of a sudden hired some very good scientists or engineers working in building associations with other supply chain partners. For example, last year we took a large group of the Taiwan TEDIBOA, the drone association. We went together to Houston, Texas for the Exponential Global Drone Show. We signed a partnership with the leading US drone association, and it really shows how quickly Taiwan business sector can organize itself. Yeah. So I don't want to talk about personnel matters, but I will say that the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, has been a really close partner with AIT and with Taiwan as we build out these supply chain partnerships. And so, as you know, DIU was established by what was then called the Department of Defense to specifically work with the commercial sector to obtain new technologies outside of traditional lines, and has been a huge resource as the US military seeks to modernize and adopt some of these new technologies. So I'll give you a few specifics. One area is that DIU worked very closely with Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense to establish the Defense Innovation Office, because I think Taiwan is also looking to use this mechanism to try to leverage those private sector advantages. Another area where DIU has been working is because they work with a lot of American companies who are developing technologies, but a lot of these companies also need secure supply chains. They've been very helpful in introducing American companies to Taiwan partners to develop their technologies. And then the third area and related area is they've helped Taiwan companies understand how to build to the standards that would be usable by the US defense supply chain. Specifically, DIU helped Taiwan understand the green and blue UAS certification system. Since that, more recently, DIU has actually given authority over that to AUVSI, which is the leading US drone organization. And so we're very pleased in January, AUVSI signed an agreement with the Industrial Technology Research Institute, ITRI, to allow ITRI to certify supply chain integrity for green UAS. This is the first place outside of the United States that is able to do that, but I think that really shows the success of this collaboration. And all of these efforts also very much support AIT's work in this area. I think a lot of people had focused on an industry day that the AIT had hosted earlier this year. Actually, we started these industry day series last year as a way of shortening the distance between the suppliers and the users of defense equipment, because technology changes so fast and because Taiwan's security requirements are so urgent, we wanted to shorten the timeline. So in the past, how normally things would work, the Ministry of National Defense would develop requirements. After that was required, they would put in a request for different equipment, and then we would try to find the right company that would be able to fill those requirements. So it was a very multi-year process. And in some sense, the suppliers were building their equipment without knowing what the requirements are. A little bit, I think Chinese say the word 闭门造车. And so a little bit disconnected from that. So our approach has been to change that. And so we have a series. So every several months, first we invite the Ministry of National Defense and Coast Guard and other users to brief U.S. industry what are the requirements they have. For example, if they need a certain counter-UAS system or they need a certain communication system. And then several months later, we invite the companies to come back and then based on what the requirements were, they can showcase the technologies that they have. And so the media reported we had 31 companies. We actually had over 60 companies. The reason we had 31 basically was mainly because of space. So many companies wanted to. So we had to be very selective. And so we had certain conditions when we selected these companies. One, obviously, was that they would, their technology or their equipment aligns with Taiwan's requirements. The second condition was that they were mature technologies. This wasn't some sort of idea. They've already developed it and prototyped it and ready for production. Third, if possible, that their technologies have already been tested on the battlefield, whether in Ukraine or in other conflicts. And fourth is that they were able to offer industrial cooperation opportunities with Taiwan, because we want Taiwan to also have the ability to produce equipment here in the island for resilience purposes. And so the companies we selected all met those criteria. And we expect to continue to do these out into the future, several times a year. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think they are very impressed, I think, with the ability for Taiwan companies to scale quickly. I think they're very impressed with their technical abilities. I think the areas where everybody has to continue to focus on primarily are two. One is in your supply chain integrity, because all of us for too long have relied on unreliable suppliers. And so we need to continuously work to find ways to reduce those supply chain risks. And that would include areas like critical minerals and rare earth materials, because as we've seen, our reliance on these materials has created vulnerabilities to economic coercion. And so that's one of the reasons we're working with ITRI and other partners in Taiwan, not only on specific supply chain for parts, but also to ensure that we have alternative supply chain for critical minerals, for things like magnets and other things that go into defense equipment. And then the second area is on cybersecurity, because that's obviously a big vulnerability for everybody. But I've seen more and more companies. I just visited a company in Taoyuan last week that is doing cybersecurity for defense supply chains. And so I think that's an area that also an area that DIU has been working with Taiwan. Third area that they would hope to see Taiwan enhance its work, and that is as we adopt more AI into uncrewed systems and other defense systems, working closely with Taiwan's semiconductor industry to design, for example, edge AI chips that can help support some of these applications. I think that's using AI is going to be the real next gen. We're already seeing it on the battlefield today, but I think, and especially in uncrewed systems, the ability to leverage AI. And Taiwan here is very, very well positioned because it has such a strong semiconductor industry, which is kind of the basis for effective AI applications. So in the future, I think that's another area where the US and Taiwan can put a focus on to even further modernize our equipment. Yeah, I think we have a global strategy to try to increase defense industrial-based cooperation with all of our allies and partners. Obviously, Taiwan is a high priority given the urgency of the threat it faces. But also, I think we have a tailored approach to each one of our partners based on their own unique characteristics or strengths. So, for example, with Japan, because we have a long experience working with them at traditional defense production, so we're looking to Japan, for example, on PAC-3 Patriot missile production to support the global demands, as well as logistics support. And with Korea, it's obviously shipbuilding, because Korea has a very strong shipbuilding industry, and that can support our Navy needs for increasing shipbuilding, both in Korea and as well as in the United States. And with Australia, because of our high level, because it's a Five Eyes partner, high level of security cooperation, we can do very advanced work in things like AUKUS, building nuclear-powered submarines. And so for Taiwan, again, going back to Taiwan's strength, I think it's the strength of technology manufacturing, especially for things, asymmetric systems like drones and counter-drone systems. It makes sense both for Taiwan's defense requirements as well as for, I think, playing to its industrial strengths. But we do, while we have a kind of different division of work, well, that's one of the purposes behind the Piper initiative that the Department of War has had. We're bringing together different partners to look at ways we can build out secure supply chains, leveraging the strengths of each of the members. Right. I mean, obviously, this is a very important step to reach Taiwan's both President Lai's goal of a 5% of GDP spend on defense, but also to fulfill Taiwan's urgent defense needs. And the U.S. has a strong interest for three main reasons. One is, according to the Taiwan Relations Act, the U.S. has the obligation to provide Taiwan the defense articles and services it needs commensurate with the threats that it faces. And the items in the special budget results as a result of a close consultation between the United States and Taiwan about, one, the threats it faces, and then two, the types of equipment it needs to support its military's efforts to achieve deterrence. And so we think that very much aligns with both Taiwan's needs and our TRA obligations. The second is the Taiwan Relations Act also obligates the U.S. to maintain sufficient military capabilities in the Western Pacific to deter any attempt to use force or coercion to change the status of Taiwan. But as the national security strategy outlines, we're very much committed to deterrence in the first island chain, but we cannot and should not be expected to do it alone. And so with the need for Taiwan to invest in these areas will make our ability to maintain peace and security much more effective. And then the third area is because the national security strategy talks about the first island chain as being a very critical geostrategic point and very focused on its defense. We believe that there shouldn't be any weak links in that chain because if there is any weak areas, that puts an increased burden on the other parts of the first island chain. And so I think we expect all of our allies and partners to contribute equally to that. And we see that those investments from Japan, we see those investments from Korea, Australia, and we very much welcome Taiwan's efforts in this regard as well. But I should emphasize that our goal in all of this is really to create conditions for dialogue, a peaceful dialogue across the Taiwan Strait to resolve differences. We believe ultimately these differences between Taipei and Beijing should be resolved through dialogue but it's a dialogue that is free from coercion or threats of the use of force. And so we think the investments Taiwan is making in deterrence will make future dialogue and future peaceful resolution of differences possible. And that remains our overriding goal, is to prevent a conflict and to ensure that any resolution is done in a way that's acceptable to both sides. Well, of course, as I mentioned, we welcome dialogue, although we think that dialogue should be with all of the parties, especially the elected leadership of Taiwan. And so we hope that in the future, that Beijing will talk to all different sectors of Taiwan society, especially those who are elected to lead the islands. At the same time, as I mentioned, we think that to have an effective dialogue, Taiwan needs to have the confidence in order to engage from a position of strength, because we've seen too many examples of when countries have tried to negotiate with from a position of weakness, the outcomes have not served their interests, and really, I think it compromises their ability to have a dialogue based on equality and respect. So again, we welcome dialogue, but we also hope that it's conducted in a way that is representative of the will of the people on both sides, as well as conducted in an environment that is free from threats and coercion. Yeah, and again, we don't see any contradiction between dialogue and deterrence. And I think that's probably accepted on the other side as well. If you think back, there was a period where Taiwan and Beijing were having a very regular dialogue. But during that period, while Taiwan's defense budget went from 2 to 1% of GDP, China's defense budget more than doubled in that same period. So I think it's clear that there is, an accepted understanding that deterrence actually is a positive factor when trying to implement dialogues. Yeah, I think what the report was suggesting is there's no imminent signs of military action, but I don't think anybody thinks that the level of threat has been reduced. I mean, frankly, in my personal view, one of the reasons I think we don't see imminent threats is because of the investments we have made, especially since, as I mentioned, 2022, whether it's in the defense work we're doing with Taiwan and Taiwan's reforms, or the work we've done on the first island chain with Japan and the Philippines. I think all of those efforts have helped deter conflict conflict, but we can't slow down because we see the threat continuing to grow. And if we want to ensure peace, we have to ensure peace through strength. And so that's why I think it's incumbent on us to continue to make the investments, because we see the threat persisting for at least the foreseeable future. And it's critical that we ensure that we have the ability to deter and dissuade any use of force. Yeah, probably the biggest change is just I think the confidence and optimism of the Taiwan people. In my previous assignments in Taiwan, I was always surprised, even though Taiwan has this amazing health system, one of the safest places on earth, a very nice standard of living, but everybody always seemed very pessimistic about the future. Even in my last tour here, when I was here in 2018 to 2021, I think it was a little bit better, but I've seen a huge change just in the 3 years I've been away. And I think the reason was, I think at that time people thought Taiwan's best days were behind it. And I think they looked across the strait and saw China growing at 7-8% every year. And Taiwan seemed to be in its kind of waning days. But coming back now, it's flipped. Now it's Taiwan that's growing 7 and 8%. And Taiwan is really dominating all of the technologies that I think everybody sees as the future. And so you see a kind of newfound sense of optimism and confidence that I hadn't seen before. And I think that's very helpful. I also see, even though the politics is and the political circle is very divided, I think the Taiwan people are much more, I think, unified behind kind of core messages and core kind of philosophies or principles. For example, maintaining the status quo. I mean, I think you look at the polls, overwhelming number of people I think are very comfortable with the status quo and aren't seeking to adjust Taiwan's status. And I think that gives stability to the cross-strait relationship as well, because that obviously was, when I was here 20 years ago, the big concern was on that. So I see confidence, but also a lot more, I think, comfort with where Taiwan is. So that's probably the biggest difference I've seen.